All right. Well, hello and welcome to tonight's live stream. So this is the online gathering place, and I am your host, Leah Petrucci. I am a licensed mental health counselor and a holistic health and lifestyle coach. And it's been a couple weeks since I've done a live stream. I've had a lot going on. I actually moved into a new apartment this week. So I've missed doing these, but I'm excited about tonight's topic, which is compassion fatigue and burnout. And we're going to actually do a little bit of an assessment later on. But before we dive into that, I'm just going to welcome everyone. If you are watching live or if you are watching the replay, at any point, I would love to, if you're watching live, would love to know where you're watching from. And you're welcome to put in the chat at any time, any comments that you have or any questions, and I will do my best to see those. And at some point, I think I will figure out how to turn on the signal, the little dingy, so I can hear when those come in. I haven't figured that part out yet, because I'm still getting familiar with this live stream program called StreamYard, which is actually pretty cool. And so what we're doing tonight, this is called the online gathering place. So this is a weekly platform where several of us are volunteers, and each week different people do different activities. And the purpose of these activities is to reduce stress. It's to teach you ways to practice self-care, maybe boost your mood, practice what's called nervous system regulation, which is kind of calming down the nervous system. And I like to, since I'm a therapist and a health coach, I like to put some education in mine. And I also try to make mine a little bit entertaining, but to make them, what do they call that? The hybrid, intercational. That's not the right word. Edutainment. That's it. Edutainment. So specifically with tonight's topic. So before we get into the assessment itself, we're going to talk a little bit about what are these things. So the title of tonight's live stream is Compassion Fatigue and Burnout for People Pleasers and Healers. And it actually is great for even more than that. So if you relate to being a people pleaser, if you relate to overgiving, if you relate to, or giving at all, doesn't necessarily have to be overgiving, but if you relate to being a giver, if you relate to being a healer, if you relate to being a helper, all of these terms and this assessment will be a really great tool for you to kind of gauge where you're at with some of these things. And I'm going to, go over the definition of each of these things as we go along. And then we're going to actually do an assessment and see where you're at, just kind of gauge where you're at with these things. And it's great because if you are watching the replay, or you can watch the replay at any time when you'd like to get a checkup, kind of gauge, I don't know, maybe where you are again in 6 months from now. We also will talk about some tips on how to combat compassion fatigue and burnout. We're going to talk about what those things are, and then we're going to talk about how to reduce those things, how to combat those, how to take better self-care, how to practice better self-care. And you can do this assessment again anytime you need to. You can do it again in 30 days. You can implement some of the strategies that I'm going to talk about, and you can retake the assessment again in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, a year, whenever you need it. So you will need a piece of paper and a pen or something to write with. Doesn't matter. You can even take out your phone and use a notepad. But that definitely will be helpful so you can keep track of what your answers are. And it would also be great to have that information. So when you do repeat this assessment down the line, you can compare your answers to what we're doing today. All right, so let's get started with some of the definitions of compassion fatigue. So that's question number one. What is compassion fatigue? Some of you may have heard of this term, but aren't quite sure what it means. So this term was actually coined in the 1980s by a man named Charles Figley. And it's basically defined as the phenomenon of stress that people experience from being exposed to another person, another individual who's going through a lot of stress or even trauma. So not necessarily our own stress and trauma. It is, but it is because of someone else's stress and trauma. And when I say the word trauma, I don't just mean like the big things, like, for example, 9/11. That was, big trauma, terrorist attacks, war, sexual assault. Yes, those count as trauma, but that's not the only things that I'm going to be talking about in talking about trauma. Trauma, really, if you get down to the root of the word, in Greek, it means wound. When we're wounded, when we are hurt, and that doesn't just mean physically, it could mean emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, financially, verbally. Anytime we feel harmed by something or someone, that counts as a trauma. Doesn't necessarily mean that we would qualify for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. As a mental health clinician, certain criteria have to exist for us to diagnose someone with post-traumatic stress disorder. But it doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have experienced trauma, everyone has experienced some kind of trauma. Everyone in their life. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have post-traumatic stress disorder, but it also could mean that. And that's definitely something that, as we go along, give you some insight into that. And of course, share some resources at the end for how you might be able to look further into that. So compassion fatigue is that fatigue that you feel, that stress that you feel from dealing with another person's stress. So as a caregiver, giving examples, if you're a caregiver, if you're caring for a loved one, even if it's not your job, if you have a loved one who's been ill, and you're caring for them, and you have compassion for them, that can be stressful. That's fatigue, and there can come with that, there can come a lot of maybe guilt and shame for feeling stressed out, when it's really just that's the nature of the situation. It can be stressful to watch a loved one go through their own stress and trauma. Other examples of people who deal with compassion fatigue are people, in the helping field. So therapists, coaches, first responders, doctors, lawyers, veterinarians, etc., daycare workers, anything that involves having compassion for someone else, and seeing over and over someone else's stress. That is basically the idea behind what compassion fatigue is. Going further, burnout is another term that we're going to talk about tonight. So burnout, most people have heard that term. So the basic definition of burnout is a state of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion caused by the depletion of one's ability to cope with their own environment. So for example, you're burned out at work, let's say. You're stressed out at work. You're no longer enjoying your job. You're feeling overwhelmed. You're not really practicing good self-care, or maybe you are practicing good self-care. You're just really stressed out about, maybe what's going on at your job. Maybe your boss isn't treating you very well. Maybe your coworkers aren't treating you very well. Maybe your clients aren't treating you very well. That can lead to burnout. Or maybe you're overworked. Maybe you're overworked and underpaid. It's too much paperwork piling up and you just don't feel like you can get everything done. You don't have that sense of joy and accomplishment at your job. That's an example of burnout. You can also feel burnout in relationships. It doesn't have to just be work related. It can be in families. Have burnout with the amount of family stress that you're dealing with, or the amount of stress that you're dealing with in a romantic relationship. Maybe you're arguing a lot and it's just causing that feeling of physical, mental, and emotional exhaustion. So that is generally what burnout is. And then the third thing we're going to talk about before we get into our assessment is secondary trauma. We're going to need to know these terms because this is what we're going to assess. We're going to assess our own level of these things. So the third thing we're going to assess is what's called secondary or vicarious trauma. And that basically occurs when you work with people who you either work with or on a personal level, you're watching people experience trauma. And due to that chronic exposure of watching other people's stress and other people's trauma, it can even cause your own secondary trauma, or what's also known as vicarious trauma. And so again, some examples of this: caregivers, helpers, first responders. But again, it doesn't have to be work related. It can be within your own family. Let's say you're caring for someone who has cancer. You're caring for a loved one who has a chronic illness. It can absolutely create what is called secondary vicarious trauma. All right. So I hope that is more clear. So now what we are going to do is move on into the assessment. Actually, before we do that, let's go over some of the symptoms of each one, and that's going to even hone in even more on how to help you identify that, to help you answer the questions with more clarity. Let's take compassion fatigue first. So what are some possible symptoms of compassion fatigue? So here are some possible symptoms. Depression. Blaming yourself that you didn't do enough, that you're not good enough, that you're not able to help that person out of their pain or solve their problem. So maybe feeling guilty, feeling shame. Maybe you even have physical symptoms like cardiac symptoms, heart palpitations, stomach distress, headaches, brain fog. Maybe you have trouble sleeping, you have trouble relaxing. You have a heightened what's called fight or flight response, like you feel overwhelmed and your heartbeat starts racing faster. Maybe you get sweaty, you have anxiety. Maybe you have anger and resentment towards the person or the situation, therefore causing a shame spiral. Grief and loss, watching a person suffer is definitely creates grief. Perhaps it has changed your view of the world, a negative worldview, like people are unsafe, people are dangerous, the world is broken, the world is terrible. Maybe it has an effect on your worldview, or maybe your view of people. It might cause excessive negative coping skills. So maybe, for example, it might lead to smoking, drinking, overeating, turning to things that are unhealthy for the body. Maybe turning to like too much scrolling on social media, or too much, binge watching TV to escape. Trust me, I'm all for TV and escaping in TV. But I also know when I'm doing it too much, and when I'm avoiding my responsibilities because I'm trying to escape. That's the difference. There's a fine line between using something as a distraction or a coping skill and using it as avoidance, or fine line between it turning into an addiction. And then the last thing for compassion fatigue, an example would be a decreased sense of professional and personal accomplishments. You just don't feel accomplished. So those are examples of compassion fatigue. If you have other examples that I didn't mention, please feel free to put them in the chat. All right, so moving on to burnout, what are some possible symptoms of burnout? So again, fatigue, chronic fatigue, just feeling exhausted all the time, maybe feeling overwhelmed, like it's just too much on your plate, never going to get through your to-do list. Maybe you start missing work, or you start missing certain home responsibilities because you're burned out, you're overwhelmed. Maybe changes in eating habits and sleeping habits, eating or sleeping more or less. Maybe physical symptoms, again, like we talked about before with the chronic fatigue or the compassion fatigue. So maybe chest pain, headaches. Maybe you get sick more often. Your immune system is compromised and you pick up sickness more easily. Maybe you feel isolated. Maybe you start to withdraw from people. You're so burned out you can't. It's too exhausting to even think about socializing with people. You don't go to when people invite you to go to hang out in social settings. Maybe you just say, no, it's okay, I'd rather stay home. Which isolation, solitude, there's a difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude is more of a healthy spending of time alone and reflecting and processing, and isolation is like a deliberate staying away from people due to avoidance. It's too overwhelming. Maybe you feel powerless. Maybe you feel hopeless as a result of burnout. Maybe you have a difficulty focusing. So all of those examples are burnout. And another one, anger, just resentment, frustrated at your job or the person or the situation. So very, very similar. There's a lot of overlaps in the two. All right, so moving on to vicarious or secondary trauma. So what are the symptoms? We already went over what it is. What are some symptoms? Okay, number one is hypervigilance. This is a term to refer to heightened startle response, or just very on edge, kind of like, what was that? What? Just very sensitive to maybe sounds, maybe even light, sensitive to light. Noises kind of startle you easily, or you're very alert. You're on high alert. You're on edge. What's going on? Nightmares. You have trouble sleeping. Flashbacks. You flash back to the memory of whatever it is that you've witnessed. Maybe if you are in the helping field, if you're a doctor, a therapist, a coach, a first responder, maybe you go home and you have flashback. You have continuous memories of the day, of what happened during your day, and you can't shut those thoughts off. And maybe you try to do things, unhealthy things, to shut those thoughts off, such as turning to substances, turning to food, turning to unhealthy coping skills. Maybe it might lead to avoidance, again, isolation, avoidance of people, places, events. Might lead to anxiety. Might struggle with memory. You might struggle to recall certain things. Short-term or even long-term memory might not be as good. The brain fog. So again, lots of overlaps, but some are more significant to the different categories. So basically, here's kind of a formula here. So compassion fatigue is essentially burnout plus secondary or what's called vicarious trauma. So that's kind of the formula. When you're experiencing compassion fatigue, you feel very burned out, and you've also been exposed to other people's stress and other people's trauma. So that compassion that you have, that empathy that you have for other people is causing you fatigue. All right, so now that hopefully you have a good understanding so far of those things. If there's any questions, if you're watching live or if you're watching the replay, please put your questions or comments in the chat. And even if you're watching the replay, go ahead and put any questions or thoughts that you have or examples, and I would be glad to respond to your comment. All right, so we're going to go on with the assessment, and then I'm going to talk about some positive things. I'm going to talk about some ways to work towards what's called compassion satisfaction. So that's the goal, is to have compassion satisfaction rather than compassion fatigue. We want to be more resilient and be able to bounce back from watching, witnessing, working with the people who are experiencing their own stress and trauma. So grab your piece of paper and a pen, and I'm going to answer some questions. I did not, I did not write down each question to put on the screen. I actually did not. Usually I would do that, but I actually didn't have time. I just moved into my own apartment just yesterday. I still have not unpacked everything. So I put this together rather quickly. So I'm just going to read them. And hopefully if you missed any of them, you can always go back and watch the replay, which is on several platforms. It's on my YouTube channel, Holistic Healing Network. It's on my Instagram, and also on our Facebook page for the online gathering place. And all that information will be in the notes of underneath the video of whatever platform you're using. All right, so get out your piece of paper. What we're doing now is called the Professional Quality of Life Scale. So that's what we're doing. This is the name of this assessment, Professional Quality of Life Scale. And it is a 30-item assessment. So we're gonna do 30 items. I will go through them fairly quickly because I want to make sure we have enough time to assess everything. All right, so number one, here's the scale that you're going to use. First of all, write on your piece of paper, number one as we go along. And this is the scale that you're going to use. So you're going to score, when I read each item, you're going to score it. If you feel like you never relate to the statement that I read, you're going to give it a 1. If you feel like you rarely relate to it, you're going to give it a 2. If you feel like you sometimes relate, a 3. If you feel like you often relate, you're going to give it a 4. And if you feel like you very often relate to the statement, you're going to give it a 5. And then we're going to add everything up. Okay, so number one, I am happy. Do you feel like you relate to this? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often, using the score on your screen. I am happy. All right, number two. I'm actually going to go through this as we go along. Okay, number two, I am preoccupied with more than one person. Actually, it's I am preoccupied with more than one person that I help. Preoccupied with more than one person that I help. Preoccupied just means I'm just really focused on that person. And when in doubt, I always put sometimes. When you're just not sure, I usually just put sometimes. All right. Number three, I get satisfaction from being able to help people. So if you relate to that statement, if you get satisfaction from being able to help people, here's the score on the screen. I'll leave it up. Never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. All right. Hello to those who have just joined us. At any point, if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We're doing an assessment to assess our level of compassion fatigue and burnout. So, and that's okay if you've just joined and you missed some of them. That's all right. Just join wherever you are at, and you can always go back and do what you missed. You can always rewatch the replay. Okay, so we're on number 3. I get satisfaction from being able to help people. Did we already say that one? Yes, we did. So write down your answer based on the score key on the screen. I get satisfaction from being able to help people. All right, moving on to number 4. I feel connected to others. All right, number 5. I jump or am startled by unexpected sounds. It's kind of that startle response we talked about earlier. So let's say you hear a sound. What was that? That's an example of a startle response, or what we call hypervigilance. So using the score key on the screen. Number 6, I feel invigorated after working with those that I help. And again, when we're talking about helping, it doesn't necessarily have to mean in a job. It could mean helping a loved one with anything. Maybe you help your child with their homework. Maybe you help a family member run an errand, whatever it is. Do you feel invigorated after working with someone that you help? All right, number 7, I find it difficult to separate my personal life from my life as a helper. And if this one doesn't really apply to you, you can always just put NA or never, I guess. If this one doesn't apply to you, like if you're not a helper in your professional life, because this one is specifically saying, differentiating between, I find it difficult to separate my personal life from my life job as a helper. So if you don't have, if that's not part of what you do, either voluntarily or, as your employment, then you can just put 1 as never. All right. And I always say when in doubt too, you can put sometimes if you are, a helper. Okay, number 8, I am not as productive at work because I am losing sleep over traumatic experiences of a person that I help. Say that one again. I am not as productive at work because I am losing sleep over traumatic experiences of a person I help. And I would go so far to say, if you're a caregiver for a loved one in your personal life, just substitute. It would read, I am not as productive at home or in my daily responsibilities because I'm losing sleep over traumatic experiences of a person I am taking care of or a person I am helping. And again, if you don't feel this applies to you at all, then just put 1 never. All right. Number 9, I think that I might have been affected by the traumatic stress of someone that I'm helping. I think I might have been affected or might be affected by the stress. This says the traumatic stress, but let's just say the stress of someone that I am helping in some way. Number 10, I feel trapped by my role as a helper or caregiver. And this again could be personally or professionally. I feel trapped by my role as a helper or caregiver. Using the answer key on the screen. Number 11, because of my helping, I have felt on edge about various things. Say that one again. Because of my helping, I have felt on edge, anxious, maybe irritable, as for example, about various things. And number 12, I like my work as a helper. I like my work as a helper. 13, I feel depressed because of the traumatic experiences of the people I help. And remember, this could be personally or professionally. I feel depressed because depressed is also another word for just sad or down. I feel depressed because of the traumatic experiences of the people I help. All right, 14. I feel as though I am experiencing the trauma of someone I am helping. I'll say that again. I feel as though I am experiencing the trauma of someone I am helping. A lot of times, if we are a caregiver, whether it's personally or professionally, we might actually experience some of the things that they experience. Maybe physical symptoms, maybe emotionally. That's that word vicarious, kind of feel, experience through watching them go through it. An example would be, interesting example, I think, would be like a husband with a pregnant wife, kind of starting to experience like morning sickness, or some of the symptoms that his pregnant wife might be experiencing. That's an interesting example. All right. 15. I have beliefs that sustain me. It doesn't really go into detail. Just I have beliefs that sustain me. Do you agree with this statement using the scoring key on the screen? When in doubt, but sometimes. All right, 16. I am pleased with how I am able to keep up with helping techniques and protocols. I am pleased with how I am able to keep up with helping techniques and protocols. And remember, this is all personally and professionally. 17, I am the person I always wanted to be. It's a tough one. All right, 18, my work makes me feel satisfied. Or we'll just say helping. Helping makes me satisfied. Let's say you are a caregiver, again, for a family member, a loved one. Does your work as a caregiver make you feel satisfied? All right, 19. I feel worn out because of my duties as a helper. All right, number 20. We're almost there. I have happy thoughts and feelings about those I help and how I could help them. I have happy thoughts about those that I help. "21. I feel overwhelmed because of my helping, because of my workload." It literally says workload seems endless. Your workload as a personal caregiver or a professional caregiver. Again, the statement is, I feel overwhelmed because of my duties as a caregiver. All right, 22. I believe I can make a difference through helping others. All right, 23. I avoid certain activities or situations because they remind me of frightening experiences of the people that I help. I'll say that one again. I avoid certain activities or situations because they remind me of frightening experiences of the people that I help. Let's see, here would be an example. Let's say you are a caregiver for a loved one who's frequently in the hospital, and you don't like going to hospitals. They create anxiety, or maybe even that heightened fight or flight response, or maybe even going to a doctor's office, something associated with that. All right, 24. I am proud of what I do to help others. Okay, 25. As a result of my helping others, I have intrusive, frightening thoughts. Intrusive just simply means like there are kind of these automatic thoughts that are intruding your time, your energy, and they're frightening. So I'll read that one again. As a result of my helping another person, I have intrusive, frightening thoughts. Okay, a couple more. Almost there. Home stretch. 26. I feel bogged down by the system. That system could mean like the medical system, the healthcare system, the legal system, any other systems, an institution, perhaps, the insurance system. Oh my goodness. Don't even get me started. Get me started on my soapbox on any of those. In fact, I probably would put number 4 for this one for myself often. I feel bogged down or frustrated, I guess is another word for that, by the system. All right, 27. I have thoughts that I am a success as a helper or caregiver. All right, number 28, I cannot recall important parts of my work with trauma victims. And, this definitely is talking about people who are employed as helpers, people who work with trauma victims, but it also can apply to caring for someone personally. Someone who's dealing with a trauma, which, to recap, a trauma refers to something, a wound, something that is harmful to them. So let me read that one again. I cannot recall important parts of my work with trauma victims. So kind of like memory loss. We talked about that as a symptom of burnout. And compassion fatigue is memory loss. You just Can't really recall certain details. I'm starting to notice memory slip. All right, 29. I am a very caring person. And last, number 30. I am happy that I chose to be a caregiver. Or some of us didn't really have that choice. So let's change that up. I am happy to be a caregiver. What do you think based on the answer score? I am happy to be a caregiver. Okay, so that is the end of that assessment. So now what we're going to do is we're going to score it. All right, so the first one we're going to score each of those 3 things we talked about. So we're going to score compassion fatigue, burnout, and the secondary traumatic stress. All right, so are we adding up everything? Okay, wait, next page. All right, got it. So what you're going to do is I'm going to read off some numbers. And as I read off those numbers, you are going to write down what your score was for those numbers. What you can do is maybe, let's do circles. We're going to do circles for compassion fatigue. And then burnout, we'll put squares around the numbers so you just know which ones to keep track of. All right, so first we're going to calculate our compassion fatigue. So what I want you to do is put a circle next to your answer for number 3. I want you to circle whatever your answer was for number 6, for number 12, for number 16, for number 18, for number 20, for number 22, 24, 27, and number 30. I'm going to say that again. So I want you to just circle these answers, these numbers, and then in a moment we're going to add up your scores for these answers. So I want you to put circles next to what your answers are for number 3, number 6, number 12, number 16, number 18, number 20, 22, 24, 27, and 30. Okay. And I know we're not all great, mathematicians. You can take out your little calculator. I won't judge you. I'm probably going to do the same. And go ahead and calculate your scores for those numbers. So for example, my score for number 3 was a 5. So that's what I'm tallying up. 5 plus my answer then for number 6 and so forth. All the ones that I asked you to circle, you're going to tally up your scores. So I'm going to give us a moment to do that. Okay. All right, so again, I hope I explained that clearly. So all those numbers that I told you to circle, you're going to take what your score was for each of those numbers, and we're going to add them up. So for example, my score for question number 3 was 5. So I'm going to add that to my score for number 6, which was a 4, and so forth. All of the ones that I said to circle. And if you missed something and you're watching the replay, just rewind me You can also, slow me down. You can change the settings of how fast I'm going. All right. And then tally up your score for those numbers. Just the ones I asked you to circle. And then we're going to go back to it in a minute. Okay, so do you have that number? If not, you can go rewind me. All right, now we're going to tally up our answers for the burnout. We're going to calculate that. So what I want you to do is put a square next to the following question numbers. So put a square next to number 1, question number 1. Put a square next to question number 4, or around question number 4. Number 8, number 10, number 15, number 17, number 19, number 21, 26, and 29. Okay, so we're just focusing on those ones that I just said, which we're going to put a square, and I'll tell you what to do with those in a moment. So again, you're going to put a square around your question number 1, number 4, number 8, number 10, 15, 17, 19, 21, 26, and 29. And what I'm going to tell you to do with these numbers is going to be a little different than what we did for Compassion Fatigue. So if you scored, hang on, let me make sure I'm reading this correctly. This one is a little trickier, of course, than the first one. So I just want to make sure I am telling you exactly what to do correctly. We have to take a little bit of an extra step on this one. Okay. So actually what I want you to do is, of those numbers that we put a square around, I want you to go back and put, like, inside that square, put a little star or asterisk by the following. There's just 4 of them. We're going to do that too. So put a little asterisk in number 1, number 4, number 15, number 17, and 29. I did ask you to square those, and that's still correct. But within the ones that we squared, you're going to further put in asterisks, because we're going to do something a little different with these scores. I didn't make up this assessment. Sorry about it. So for number 1, put in asterisks or star, whatever. Also to number 4, to number 15, to number 17, and to number 29. What we're going to do with those that we've starred, we are going to do a reverse score. So, for example, if you scored the item 1, you're going to write a 5. You're going to do what's called a reverse score. You're going to write a 5 by it. And it goes into the reason why, but it's honestly too complicated. So I'm not even going to spend time saying that. So the items I just asked you put a star by, we're going to reverse score them. So for example, if you scored the item 1, you're going to write a 5 beside it. You're going to reverse score it. So let's say you wrote, you scored a 2. You're going to reverse score that. You're going to double that. That's kind of confusing, isn't it? I went over this before we did it, and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I get it. Now I'm like, no, I'm not quite getting that. Okay, so go back to the answers that you put an asterisk by. So let's start with number 1. For example, I scored a 4, so I'm going to do a reverse score. So instead of 4, I'm going to put a reverse score, which is a 2. If you scored a 1, you're going to reverse score that and put instead a 5 next to it. If you scored a 4, for example, you're going to reverse that and put a 2. And then if you scored a 3, there is no reverse to that. You're just going to keep it at a 3. So go ahead and do that for each one that you put the asterisk by. You're going to do what's called a reverse score. So I'll give you an example. For number 1, I scored a 4, so I'm going to reverse that and put a 2. For number 4, my answer was a 3. There's no reverse to that, apparently, so I'm just going to keep it at the 3. The next one that I asked you to star is number 15. I, again, scored a 3, so that's going to remain the same. I hope that is making sense. My apologies if it is not. It's a little weird on this one. All right. And then we're going to take those new numbers, those reverse scores, add those up. And then we're going to add that to the remaining questions that we put a square by. So take a moment and just add up that new reverse score to the ones that we put an asterisk or a star beside. Go ahead and just add those new scores up. And then you're going to take that number and add it to the remainder of your scores for the ones that I asked you to put a square around. The ones that are not starred, just the ones that are squared. Okay. The next section is going to be easier, I promise. I'm sorry that this one was a little weird. But you can always go back and replay it. So basically, we're taking the items that I asked you to put an asterisk by. I asked you to reverse the score that you put. You're going to add those numbers up, and then you're going to add it to the remainder of the answers that you put a square around with no asterisk. I'm a pain in the butt, that one. All right. Hopefully that made sense. Again, my apologies. That one was a little weird. All right, so now we're going to calculate our score for secondary trauma. This is going to be much easier, I promise. I actually ran out of paper. All right, so what I want you to do this time is you're going to, let's put a check mark. Let's do check marks around the following numbers. Number 2, put a check mark next to it. Check mark next to number 5. Number 7. Number 9. Number 11. 13. 14. 23. 25. 28. So you're going to put check marks next to question numbers 2, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, 14, 23, 25, and 28. Okay. So of those that you put check marks by, you're going to add up what your answer was, what your number for those questions. Total your scores for those ones I just said. Okay, and this one that we're doing now is your level of secondary traumatic stress. All right, so hopefully you have scored each one. And what I did was, the first one where we did the circles, I put compassion fatigue, and I put my total score. Second one, the burnout, that's the one we did with the ones that were squared and asterisk. It was kind of a combination of both. You put that total. And then the third one we did was the check marks next to them. That is our level of secondary trauma. All right, so now I'm going to go over basically what these numbers mean. So take your total score that you received for your compassion fatigue, the first one we did. If your score was 22 or less, then this assessment indicates that you have a low level of compassion fatigue. I don't know, is it saying compassion satisfaction? I'm sorry. Compassion satisfaction, which I find that interesting. It's switched it up. I'm sorry. It's not. The first one we did, I thought, was about compassion fatigue. But actually, we were scoring our level of satisfaction with our work. When did it kind of switch things up? So saying that again. So if you scored 22 or less, then you have a low level of compassion satisfaction. And sorry, I keep messing up my camera because I have my notes sitting behind my laptop. Let me pull that up. Okay, so compassion satisfaction, that's your level of satisfaction with the work that you do. Your level of satisfaction with being a helper, with being a caregiver, basically the opposite of compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is you don't feel happy, you feel stressed, you feel, all the symptoms that we went over in the beginning. Compassion satisfaction is when you feel fulfilled in your work, you enjoy being a helper. So if you scored a 22 or less, then you have a pretty low level of satisfaction, of compassion satisfaction. If you scored between 23 and 41, then you have a moderate level of satisfaction with your duties as a caregiver or with your work as a helper. And then if you scored 42 or higher, then you have a high level of satisfaction in your work or your duties as a caregiver. So I hope that kind of gauges where you are. In a moment, we're going to talk about that. All right. And the second one we did was the burnout scale. That one was the more complicated one. So if your score for that one was 22 or less, same numbers here, 22 or less, then you have low burnout, which is pretty good. You know, low level of burnout. Maybe you feel like you have a handle on things. Low stress level. If you have scored between 23 and 41, then you have a moderate level of burnout. And then if you scored higher than that, if you scored 42 or higher, then you have a high level of burnout. So stay tuned. We're going to talk about some ways to combat that. So again, 22 or less, low level of burnout. Between 23 and 41, you have moderate level, and 42 or more, you have a high level of burnout, with being either a personal caregiver or a professional. All right, so now we're going to take the score for the secondary trauma scale. 22 or less. If you scored 22 or less on this one, then you have a low level of secondary trauma. And again, just to remind you, secondary trauma is that stress that we ourselves feel in response to caring for someone else that is dealing with stress and trauma. So if we scored lower than 22, then we have a pretty low level. So in other words, we're not terribly affected by secondary or vicarious trauma. If we scored between 23 and 41, then we have a moderate level of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. And I'll put that up. That vicarious trauma. And then if we scored 42 or higher, we have a high level of secondary trauma. In other words, we're very affected by either our professional role as a helper or caregiver, or professionally, either personally or professionally. So if we scored 42 or more, we're very affected by that secondary trauma. Okay, so get your scores. And so what we're going to do is go over at this point a little bit of what if we scored high? You know, what do we do? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we practice self-care? If we're a caregiver and, you know, we either don't have a choice or, you know, that's our work. How do we bring that number down? How do we practice that self-care? And there's lots of different ways to practice self-care and to feel more resilient, to be able to bounce back. So, and these are intentional activities. Self-care is very intentional, meaning you do it on purpose. You schedule it even. You plan it. Sometimes it's very spontaneous. Sometimes self-care can be very spontaneous, and that's good. That's okay too. But you're purposeful about it. You purposefully practice these rituals, these routines on a regular basis, daily even. It doesn't have to take a lot of time. It could be, 5 minutes here and there. If you don't have 5 minutes, it could be 30 seconds. Sometimes there are things that you can do that are so quick that can just really reduce that level of anxiety, that level of burnout. But self-care is basically defined as conscious, intentional activities and habits that contribute to help a person reach their personal goals and values. Do you want to feel better? Do you want to feel compassion, satisfaction? Do you want to feel good in the work that you do? Then be mindful about it. Intentionally schedule things. Engage your mind, your body, and your overall outlook on life. Create a routine to build intentional time for yourself. It's okay to start small and work your way up. It could look like, for example, key areas of self-care: getting adequate sleep, eating good nutrition, making sure you're hydrated, getting some movement, getting some physical activity, spending some time relaxing, spending some time socializing with other people outside of your caregiving role, having fun. Could look like, going to a movie, going to dinner with a friend, going by yourself, watching your favorite thing on Netflix, but making sure that you're not turning it into a binge, fest where you're avoiding, your daily responsibilities. That's the difference between avoidance and self-care. It could look like you go treat yourself to a massage, you can, go shopping. Of course, retail therapy there's a fine line there. Remember we talked about what's the fine line. If it's in moderation and it's something that is designed as a treat and not something that you go to, to avoid and turns into an addiction, then that does qualify as more self-care. And it's a process, like some of us maybe aren't good at it now, or had a time when we weren't good at it, but we had to practice and we slowly got better over time. I used to be horrible at self-care. My self-care was terrible. I didn't eat right. I didn't sleep right. I didn't get enough water. I didn't go to the doctors, or I just went to the doctor and just got, pills to cover up the symptoms rather than like really practice good lifestyle changes. So it's a process, and starting small, doing things that you enjoy. What you see as self-care might be completely different than what someone else sees as self-care. And it doesn't just include, like beauty treatments. Like, yes, that does count, for us ladies, like retail therapy or going to get our nails done or massage. Yes, that counts, but that's not the only thing that self-care involves. It's being healthy, taking care of yourself. Taking care of yourself so you can show up for someone else. If you're not taking care of yourself, how are you going to show up for somebody else? You're not going to be able to do it very well. You're going to burn out. So that's a couple of ways. And if you have suggestions, I would love to hear them in the comments. If you're watching the replay, what are some examples of things that you love to do for self-care? And here's another thing that we can talk about: self-compassion. Not only have compassion for, the person that you're helping, but have compassion for yourself. So how do you begin to do that? Create a positive inner dialogue. So rather than beating ourselves up of, gosh, I feel so guilty, I'm frustrated about being a caregiver, and be gentle with yourself, say, oh, gosh, what I'm doing is really hard. This is hard. This is challenging my limits, my physical limits, my emotional limits, my psychological limits. I'm doing the best that I can with the resources that I have. That's one of my favorite affirmations. So I'm doing the best that I can. And sometimes you may not feel like you are doing your best, but sometimes you really are doing your best with the maybe the limited energy that you have that day. Sometimes your best is, hey, I was able to take a shower today, and that's it. Cool. Yeah. Sometimes we're only able to do little things. Expressing gratitude for the things that we do have versus focusing on the things that we don't have. Sometimes that can really be a challenge. Maybe even making a gratitude list, sharing it with other people. Allowing self-forgiveness. Forgive yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Drop the bat and pick it up. Pick up the feather, as an old mentor of mine used to say. Drop the bat. Back up the truck, girlfriend. She used to say to you, back it up. Back up the truck. Pick up the feather. Be gentle with yourself. Ask for help. Ask for help. Create community, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. Ask for help. Hey, I just really need a break. Can you help me with this thing? Reach out for resources. Nurture your belief that you are making a difference, even though you might not feel like you are. Maybe you don't feel like you are helping this person with their problem. Maybe you're having imposter syndrome, which is something that's very common to helpers. especially when you're not seeing any results, or if you're caregiving for someone and they're not getting better and they're still in pain, you kind of feel like, well, what am I suck. I'm not doing my job. Like, this person is not getting better. Nurture that belief that you're doing the best that you can. And oftentimes you can come up with all of these things to help the other person. And if they're not ready yet, we can't force that. I've struggled with that many times within my business, within my family, trying to do the best that I think that I can do to share things or provide suggestions. And if that person is just not ready for that, then that's not your fault. Remember why you're doing what you're doing, going over your why, maybe even writing out your why. Why am I doing this? Getting back in touch with, why did I just sign up to do this in the first place? Oh yeah, it's because I remember I like to help people. I like the feeling that I get when I help people. Oh yes, okay, it's because this is a loved one. Getting back in touch with your why. Recognizing that what you're doing is taxing, it's stressful, and it's okay to give yourself grace. If you would give someone else grace, give yourself that same grace. Take your own advice. What would you tell a friend? You would tell a friend to be gentle with themselves, wouldn't you? So give yourself that same advice and grace. That's self-compassion. Sometimes it's a lot easier to give other people that positive feedback more than it is to give it to ourselves. All right. And the last thing is, how can we create community? Find others who can relate to what you're going through and seek support. There are support groups out there for caregivers, for people who are caring for people with chronic illness. Oftentimes it's really just a Google search, searching for like caregiver support near me, or getting more specific, caregiver support for cancer survivors, caregiver support for autoimmune disorder, for chronic illness, or caregiver support, or support for first responders, support for therapists, support for coaches, things like that. Facebook is a great place to also find groups, free groups, and that way you can, get your foot in the door. 12-step groups also is a great way to find community. And there's so many different 12-step groups. You could even, I think, Google 12-step groups and probably find a website that'll tell you all the different 12-step groups that there are out there that exist. If you have a relative who is dealing with addiction and that's something that you're struggling with, burnout, Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, Al-Anon.org, Nar-Anon.org, Codependence Anonymous, CODA, CODA.org, Codependence Anonymous. Great 12-step fellowship. If you feel like you're caregiving for someone and you feel like, you're struggling with caring for someone and it's bleeding into your own self-care, you're overgiving, you're people pleasing too much, and it's causing burnout and resentment. Codependence Anonymous is a great resource. It's free. Got online meetings, in-person meetings. Seek people. It's important to seek people who are going to validate your feelings, not surrounding yourself with critical people who aren't going to support your efforts. And engage in active listening with other people. Listen to other people that are going through the same thing. Provide, give back to them as well. Validate them as well. Help out your colleagues when you're able. A lot of times compassion fatigue is we don't have anything left to give, and that's okay sometimes. Sometimes we need to receive. Allow yourself to receive that help. When we are caregivers, we also need to learn how to receive. Sometimes we get so bogged down with being a caregiver, we don't allow ourselves to receive help from other people. And then finding a community can also help keep you accountable for your self-care efforts and help you to be accountable for your self-compassion as well. Find a therapist, find a therapist or a coach. That's another great example. And there are some, in the notes, I have included some resources for how to find a therapist in your area. Of course, if you enjoy the work that I offer and you would like to work with me, I am a therapist in the state of Florida. So if you are a Florida resident, I will give you information on how you can get in touch to work with me. But if you're not a Florida resident, I am also a holistic health and lifestyle coach. So there are lots of things that I can do as a coach if you are not a Florida resident. Coaching and counseling, there are differences. There are similarities, but there are differences. I would be glad to go over all of that with you and discuss further if that would be a good option for you. If that is something that you are interested in, you can go to my website, which is leahpetrucci.com. Put it right here on the screen. So leahpetrucci.com. You can read a little bit more about the services that I offer. I do offer support for caregivers, for helpers, among other things. Support for self-care. That's like my bread and butter right there, is helping people to take better care of themselves, no matter what. If they're a caregiver or if they're not, they just want to practice better self-care in mind, body, spirit, and relationships, then that's my bread and butter. So I'd love to talk with you further. You can go to my website, you can schedule a free 30-minute consultation, and we can talk further and see if we're a good fit for each other. All right, so that is the end of tonight's presentation. My apologies, we went a little bit over tonight. There was a lot there, and the assessments, there was a little confusing places, but hopefully this was helpful for you. Like I said, you can go back and rewatch the replay at any time. If you have any questions about anything, you can put comments, questions in the chat, or you can simply schedule a consultation with me. I'd be glad to answer any of your questions. All right, so if you liked tonight's live stream, there's also other nights of what we call the online gathering place. And I do them every Wednesday night at 8 p.m. I did change the time to 8 p.m. Eastern. We'll see how that works out. I had to change the time from 7 to 8 for scheduling reasons. We'll see how that works out. If you want to volunteer to do activities, and they can be anything you want, really. Doesn't have to be like this. You can lead any type of activity to help someone, help improve their mood, or, just give someone something to do, maybe lead someone in a game or an activity. You can volunteer, and you can send an email to theonlinegatheringplace@gmail.com and just express any interest that you have to lead an online live stream. So, all right, well, that's it, folks. Stay tuned for next week's topic, which I don't actually recall what we are doing next week. But if you want to get on my email list, which tells you ahead of time what the topics are, then again, you can go to my website, leahpetrucci.com, and there is an opportunity to get on my email list and get a freebie. And I believe it is on the homepage. You'll see the opportunity to receive my free newsletter, and every week you'll get notified of what the topic is. Or you can also look at my Facebook page, which is Holistic Healing with Leah Petrucci is the name of my business Facebook page, and there's always posts telling you what the upcoming topic is for that week. And anyway, I hope, wish you all a good rest of your week, and hope to see you soon. Have a good night. Have a good day. Have a good night, whatever day it is, whatever time it is you're watching. See you next time.